Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Carl Sawatsky on behalf of CTC Train Canada. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you to today's webinar, 3 Reasons to Join the DevOps Movement. So as with many IT frameworks that are out there, as well as their related certifications, whether it be ITIL, TOGAF, COBIT, a lot of talk out there about them, their value, and one that we definitely can't neglect or forget about is DevOps, and that'll be the focus of today's webinar. So we'll have a chance to look at what exactly is DevOps, what value it can bring to your team, and what benefits you can expect from implementing DevOps. We have with us today Nasser El-Batel, so we have very well positioned to respond to these questions for us. Close to 30 years of experience in the field of corporate IT, most of that involved in IT service management. And he's also one of our senior instructors teaching courses on DevOps, as well as COBIT, TOGAF, ITIL. So we're very much looking forward to Nasser's presentation. So again, thank you for joining. We look forward to your participation as well. And yes, Nasser, we leave the word with you now. Help us understand 3 reasons that we should look at joining the DevOps movement. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. As Carl presented, DevOps more and more is becoming a very interesting topic in the market, and a lot of organizations are actually engaging in introducing it and learning about it because the benefit that it actually carries, to the organization. I would like to, keep in mind is that DevOps still somewhat in its early stages. So it's not as mature as other frameworks that you might hear of, being it ITIL or COBIT or TOGAF and so on. But nevertheless, even though still kind of let's call it junior in the IT industry, at least in recent development, but nevertheless, it carries a lot of benefits, to the organization. The presentation is basically set up in such a way to have a kind of a high-level understanding. I mean, again, we have an hour or less, so a high level of understanding of what DevOps is all about, the goals, the objectives, the overall approach, and certainly when we talk about business value, business benefits, and what practices DevOps use to fall back on. Something very important to keep in mind is that DevOps is not a structured framework per se, like ITIL or TOGAF or project management and so on. It's more of a cultural movement. It's more of an approach to doing things a certain way. And of course, its focus is really on software development, as well as the IT operational side of things. So it emphasizes a great deal on the end-to-end perspective of development all the way through, including operation. Also, the idea behind DevOps is that we are going to introduce software in a much faster way than traditionally established. So the building, the testing, the releasing, right? It's happening on an ongoing basis, eliminating potentially any bottlenecks along the way through the use of a number of different best practices that we already know about in the industry. So something very important to keep in mind, again, this is not, per se a standard or a framework. It's more of a cultural and professional movement. Very important to keep that in mind, all right? So DevOps is not, associated, or let me rephrase, DevOps itself is not structured as a team or a tool or only automation or only culture, but rather it encompasses, all of the above in order to enable, a good job, and in order to enable the overall approach to introducing software, faster, more frequently to the live environment with minimum and or even negligible type of issues, incidents, or problems as we know it. So what the goals are is more and more alignment with the business. This is an interesting topic because, as we all know, the business moves fairly quickly, and it's always in need of IT to be there to enable and to support them. Traditionally speaking, in many cases, especially when you follow the traditional approaches, waterfall approach as an example, the business is way ahead and IT is kind of dragging behind because everything that we do has to be totally completed before we're able to introduce. So we're always kind of almost looking at that big bang approach all the time, where now we have a much, better way of doing it and a faster, smaller, more frequent releases to enable certain functionalities and increment right along the way to the completeness of the system or the service at the end of the day after the cycle is completed. Also very important to the business, time to market as an example, the quality of your application, of course customer satisfaction, very, very useful and very important to the business so that your customers are retained and your customers are satisfied with the solution that you're providing, that your customers are not held back, right? Just waiting for the traditional waterfall methods to take place. So this way, at least you can introduce the different bits and pieces that the customer can use to an effort to perform their business concerns. Also, practices that DevOps fall back on, things to eliminate waste or to minimize waste, and of course, making sure that we are cost effective along the way. Some of the concerns, or rather some of the evolutions that we have seen with DevOps since it's been introduced is its correlation and now effort and alignment to the virtual world, right? So as an example, when we talk about organizations migrating to the cloud, does that mean that the operation consideration has been eliminated because somebody else is looking after it, or because that means that we have no more operation to consider from our side of things, right? So again, this is a consideration from a DevOps perspective. Is this going to be no operation or new operation, depending on how you see things? So something to consider, right? What we have seen so far, at least from those organizations who adopted the approach, they adopted more of a hybrid approach, so basically using the local as well as the cloud infrastructure approach. And of course, with that in mind, you have to consider governance, risk, compliance, and so on, depending on your type of operation. As I said, the business is pretty much on a fast track, and the business, at many cases, many times, they turn urgent requirements, and you need to be able to respond to that. As simple as that. You need to be able to respond to the business. You need to be able to provide stable, reliable IT services. So in line with the business, not because we see that it's better, or we see that it's cheaper, or we see for whatever other reasons. And this is one of the main actually reasons as to why DevOps is becoming more and more successful. It's because we're trying to eliminate as much as we can, all the bottlenecks along the way to stay, in line with the business in the same speed that the business is trying to move forward. Some of the basic reasons, and also you can consider them, if you wish, benefits as to why the business is driving DevOps, is pretty much technology. Technology is becoming more and more, right, a big reason to changing the behavior, in the market, right? So businesses, I mean, a few years ago, we used to say, and we still, as a matter of fact, that business is IT and IT is the business. So historically speaking, all different types of businesses have become very much dependent on technology, almost to the point where the business is becoming, right, almost a tech business or an IT-based business, right? So this is very, very important to keep that IT concern, in parallel to business goals and objectives, right? The overall value, the customer value, the customer looks at the outcome. They don't just look at the product. The customer looks at whether, what you're providing is going to enable their business, to strive and enable their business functionality and so on. They're not looking as much at the product, perspective as much as, they're concerned about how the approach or how the application is going to enable their business outcome. Again, how fast can I reap benefit? How fast can I capture business value rather than just, how fast I need to be in the market? So a lot of these considerations. Also, the business needs to be very dynamic, especially when we say something like competition, is a startup. And today, a lot of these big boys are actually competing with a lot of the startup organizations because they're very dynamic, they're very flexible, they're willing to kind of almost deliver on the spot, if you wish, through all of these different, cultures that's being introduced. And certainly DevOps is one of these cultures. From an IT point of view, now we need to respond, right, to the business. So if you take a look at both perspectives, basically there are no changes. We're both trying to see the same thing, whether it's the business driving DevOps or IT driving DevOps. We're trying to see the same common perspective on both sides of the fence, right? So it's almost identical, right? That means that both sides, whether the business or IT, are starting to realize that they need to work together, that they need to work in collaboration, that they need to basically support and enable each other and jointly introduce to the customer, business value and business outcome. Now, in terms of why should the business be concerned about DevOps? Because pretty much it enables, the profitability, the market share, the productivity much faster than the traditional approach, right? So with DevOps, more and more we're looking at, better performance. More and more we're looking at, eliminating waste. More and more we're looking at frequent, capture of benefits, right? And this is why, when we talk about high-performing companies, these are the ones where you see that they're exceeding their goals, they're exceeding their profitability, their even market share and so on, because of the methods that they are following. And DevOps is one of these methods. When we're talking about One of the concepts, as an example, and we're going to see this soon, one of the concepts we talk about is ensuring that, the speed, right, and elimination of waste, elimination of bottlenecks that enables that speed, right? So that becomes your competitive advantage, right, along the way. Also, the agility. So DevOps, as I said, falls back on a lot of the existing best practices, right? Organizations, historically speaking, that used and or followed DevOps are much more, agile, much more capable to introduce code and to deploy, into their live environment, right? Their services are more reliable. Their restoration is much faster, and basically they benefit not just from the thinking behind DevOps, but also in terms of the existing best practices and the automation associated with the whole concept. So it's a collection of considerations that you need to keep in mind. As you notice at the bottom of the screen, we're using some of the data that's coming from DevOps reports, something you can also tap into if and when you have some additional time. Some of the values, right, some of the core values is what we call, calms. So the culture is a big thing, a very big thing. And then, of course, automation, the lean approach, your measurements, and sharing, the roles and responsibilities. One of the biggest hurdles, right, is the cultural aspect. And if you don't change the culture, then this is not going to be successful. This is the same discussion we have when we're talking about agile methodology, right? If you don't change the way you're doing things, if you don't change the way you think about things, if you don't change the way the organization behaves, right, then this is going to be very difficult to happen. So from a DevOps, point of view, calms is something to keep in mind. Again, it's based on the interaction between the human factor and the technical factor in effort to, of course, improve relationships and improve results. The driver behind all of this is to really have a solid understanding of the why, right? Or as we call here, the golden circle. Why are we doing this? What is the purpose? What is the belief behind it that, the organization is in existence and doing what it's doing? So it's very important to understand that. Also, it's very important to understand, what differentiates you in terms of how you're doing things, and eventually what you are introducing in terms of product and services. And this is gonna trigger a different approach for different organizations in terms of, the behavior, but also in terms of introducing DevOps in general. So very important to understand, right, as we call it, raison d'etre behind the organization. Also, don't forget that IT is actually a very big part of your business value stream, right? So you're not going to be able to introduce that value if there is waste, or if there is change resistance, or if you're not agile enough. So very important, right, that you have an appropriate approach and where the value is actually properly defined as the customer sees it, not as you see it or as you define it. This is something that the customer is going to define, and then based on what the customer needs, are all about, then you would approach from your perspective. So some of the information that you're going to capture, as an example, the famous balanced scorecard, in terms of the why at the vision and benefits, in terms of, things like productivities or revenues or, whether it's hard benefit, in other words, or soft benefits, your ROIs or intangible benefits. The how, what kind of products you're going to be introducing, what kind of work stream you're going to be introducing, and eventually your learning and growth. So all of this is a reflection of what your DevOps going to look like from strategic, tactical, and operational layers within the organization. So it has to align with some measurables, otherwise you're not going to see that benefit. So what we're trying to do there is basically show you in terms of the involvement of the teams and their level of agility versus, right, the deployment of the resources. So if the teams, as an example, are low in terms of agility and in terms of, how should I say this, software design, right, then you're working in bad work practices versus if you're going to increase that level of maturity, then the team, is less bad, if you wish, but then you're increasing, right, your practices themselves, you're increasing the software approach, more and more as you become more agile and as you start engaging on regular basis, as long as you start looking at things from an agile perspective and following, the agile method and even eventually the Scrum approach, then it becomes, the Rolls Royce of the approach, and then people will have a much better appreciation, and you have much better software. You will have your team behaving, and dealing with the overall approach on regular basis from an agile perspective as a habit now, rather than just kind of, oh yeah, we'll look at this once a month or once a quarter. Now it becomes a daily perspective on things, right? And it becomes a much higher level of maturity. Some of the concepts associated with Agile specifically, some of you may have known or may have read about the Agile Manifesto. So traditionally speaking, what you notice in many organizations is that the processes, the contracts, as an example, are in some cases too much, right? They buckle the organization. They kind of constrain the organization. It's like, it's good to have a process, but as long as we can do what we need to do, not to the point that the process is buckling or handcuffing you from the end result, right? So once the process becomes too much, right? Once the process becomes tedious, then it's not useful anymore, right? And this is why we're saying, yeah, I mean, although we value everything that we see on the right-hand side, right? We value all of this. However, we value the left side even more. Why? Because the left side basically makes us, work, makes us achieve the result much faster. So I would much rather to collaborate with the customer, right? Of course, using a contract, than use the contract as a penalty stick, or rather than use the contract as a method to almost hurt the relationship rather than facilitate it, right? So we much value the interaction and the working software and the collaboration and the response to the change than what we see on the right-hand side in terms of, the things that may slow you down, right? We're not saying we don't need them. We're not saying that they don't have value. They do, but at the same time, we want to make sure to keep that flow, moving. So we do value the left side even more. So some of you already have heard or know of Scrum. Yeah. As they call it, a simple framework, but it's very difficult actually to master. But this is again what we call just enough structure, right, in order to get the job done, right? And of course, today, as everybody probably knows, Scrum is one of those very commonly used agile methods, and enable you to introduce multiple, increments rather than just wait for everything to be done and everything to be tested and you have one big result and so on. Okay, so again, it's very simple at face value, but difficult to master. I do encourage you to actually download the Scrum guide and go through it. It will show you some of the benefits associated with it. So again, some of the reasons behind the level of importance for DevOps and why it's important now. You have to compete, right, with the startups, right? More and more, the agile, right, approach is being required. You can no longer work in silos. You have to look at the integration. You have to look at the workflow. You have to look at the feedback and continual improvement side of things, right? Again, it's more at considerations of the business benefits, the customer benefits, right? So because of all of this, more and more you notice and you realize that we are looking to be more continuous, right, in our approach. In other words, things that you can establish at a certain perspective where you're always readily available, as an example, to introduce or to move to the next step, right, or to deploy without being bogged down by the traditional considerations. Now, who's doing DevOps? This is just a set of examples. So as you notice, a lot of the big known web-based companies, the banking industry, retailers, pretty much a big portion of the industry using it, and more organizations are getting on board. One of the big challenges, though, that you have to keep in mind is that best practices in general have been speaking this language for a lot of years, not in the same structure, if you wish, or in the same perspective that DevOps has introduced, but we always talked about integration. We always talked about, collaboration. We always talked about communication and so on. So this is actually still one of the very difficult challenges, when you introduce something like DevOps into any organization, especially because it's a new way of thinking, especially because it's a different way of thinking. So you need to ensure that your people are on board with that. So DevOps as an idea is really falling back on the different best practices that are industry. So I mentioned as an example, Agile, IT service management, ITIL, COBIT, right? Lean IT, Six Sigma, right? And of course, heavy on automation. So without, these best practices, DevOps is not going to be successful. Very simple, right? Because DevOps is not a tool. It's not, again, a framework or a standard. So it actually falls back on all of these things. So depending on what you're doing, you may be, using multiple of these frameworks, right? So something to keep in mind. This is pretty much the same story. We are leveraging the best practices that we have in the industry, right? And this list actually is kind of almost the closest to what DevOps is using. So you have to keep in mind that if you want to introduce it onto your organization, you want to make sure that you have some basic best practices in place. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult really to make it work, right? So DevOps itself is not reinventing the wheel. It's rather using, integrating, tapping into, whatever you want to call it, right, across all of these different best practices. And this is an example that usually we use. So DevOps end-to-end, I'm considering all the development, right, all the way to, right, operation, but also how I'm going to get from here to there, right? So as you notice, we're trying to keep as straight line as possible. Along the way, we're trying to be continuous as possible, you know, from a testing point of view, from a delivery perspective, from an integration, from a monitoring, right? So how you go from one phase to another, to another, to another, and so on, very important from the DevOps perspective. Also, Agile and Agile Service Management, ITIL is providing a bunch of different processes that DevOps can use, again, whether at on the release side or the change control side or the operation incident problem, as an example, event and event management side. And of course, end-to-end as well, you're going to notice that DevOps is very big on continual improvement. And as you move from left to right, the requirement for collaboration increases across the different groups within the organization. Traditionally speaking, as an example, if you're talking about technical management, operation management, application management, and so on, you know, all of these different groups, you know, used to be different silos, and now with best practices more and more, we're trying to get them together. And DevOps, of course, emphasizes that, you know, this is a very, very important consideration to get the benefits associated with the approach so that you establish the appropriate collaboration across the board. We use different ways. And by the way, I do encourage you, for those of you who are interested to know a little bit more, right, there is the Phoenix project. This is developed by Gene Kim, one of the basically pioneers behind DevOps. And it's a nice story to introduce the different ways that DevOps basically is introducing in terms of how do we consider the flow and what do we do with it and what do we need to strive, you know, to achieve. So first, we need to make sure that our flow is actually moving smoothly from left to right. Your workflow, your process flow, your development flow, whatever you want to call it. And then not just working smoothly, also being able to receive feedback, right, so that you do improvements, right? So as you move, right, from left to right, now you want to be able to kind of provide feedbacks in order to improve that situation. Along the way, the third way, as we call it, you know, experimentation and learning. So now you're actually introducing, you know, reasons to fail the approach so that you can learn from those failures, right? So at high level, these are what we call the different ways of DevOps, and as they are explained in the Phoenix project, right? So this shows you that improvement is very important, and we need to understand the reasons behind the failure so that we can increase the flow, right, as we introduce it for the work, for the process, for the application development and release, and so on and so forth. Different practices that are being introduced as well. You know, application pipelines, application platform interfaces, programming interfaces, agile service management, containers, cookbooks, you know, microservices, architectures that support service orientation. There's a lot of new practices that are coming up. The question or the concern now is not just to jump, you know, and pick up everything that's being introduced in the industry just because. You want to make sure that they actually work properly for you, and then you can adopt, you know, whatever it makes it better. From the automation perspective, this is a quick example in terms of what organizations or what vendors can offer, right? Tools to enable you that automation. Some of them, of course, are more capable than others, so we'll leave that for you to do the homework on it. But basically, culture, not just automation, culture, as I said, is very, very important, and you need to work on that. You need to make sure that, you know, the way to behave, the way to think, the way to work, the collaboration between people. Example, historically speaking, I developed something, I come in, I throw it over the fence, and I'll tell you, your support and production, now it's your problem, see you. Well, this is not the concept from a DevOps perspective. DevOps said, you develop it, right? You support it, right? Agile, you know, will tell you in terms of accountability, as an example, you know, it's now a different perspective than the traditional understanding. Although you may have, you know, a product owner per se, but then, you know, the team is accountable. It's not the person accountable anymore. So things to consider, right? So in order to change culture, you pretty much, you know, need to change behavior, and the new behavior becomes your new culture. So something to keep in mind. So with that said, any questions that I can answer for you?
I haven't seen any come in as of yet throughout the webinar, Nasser. So anybody, if you do have a question, now's your opportunity. Please enter that into the chat box, and I would be happy to forward that to Nasser. So yes, please take advantage of Nasser's expertise, experience, what he can share with you for any questions you may have.
I want to bring to your attention, guys, I mean, this, as you can see, we are associated with the DevOps Institute, and our accreditation is from the DevOps Institute. But also I want to bring to your attention that, you know, since I would say we're now January, I would say since October, somewhere around October, you know, if anybody is familiar with Exxon is involved. Now we have a consortium of companies called DASA. We have, of course, the DevOps Institute, just to mention a few, right, who are now involved, right, at different levels of certifications. So the DevOps Institute will be introducing, you know, 4, you know, or 5 new certifications. DASA is introducing 3 different certifications. Exxon is introducing 1 certification. And everybody pretty much in the industry, if they're not introducing the concept, they're considering, they're thinking about it, right? As I said, this is not a tool-based or a framework or a standard type of approach. There is some philosophy behind it, and you really need to understand that we all have to work together in a different way of our current approach. Yes, we're going to fall back on existing best practices. Yes, there are some new kind of considerations, but these considerations are not actually new. They are already been there, right? We're just bringing them to light, right? So the Agile Manifesto, this is not something new, right? It's been there for years, but now we're bringing up to light to highlight the fact that, you know, you want to make sure that you are introducing what works for you without, you know, kind of handcuffing yourself in terms of your capability, or just go for process because we have to go for process. So if the process is too rigid, well, it's going to cause an adverse reaction. It's like taking medication, but if it's not the right medication, it's going to cause you to be sick, right? So it's the same concept. DevOps Institute is basically the leader that actually introduced DevOps to begin with, and they are very heavily involved in its development and evolution since it has been introduced. You can go to their website, and of course you can see what additional information they can provide you. From our perspective, we certainly have the ability to assist you in becoming DevOps certified. And of course, we follow an accredited course by the DevOps Institute, and we follow their syllabus in order to get you the proper level of certifications. What's available thus far is the foundation level. All these additional certifications that I was talking about, these are kind of forecasted to be introduced in Q2, Q3, and so on. And they will take time before they become available in the market. So as it stands now, what's available is the foundation certification. And again, it's a 2-day course, and we'll certainly talk in much further details about what DevOps is all about and the methodologies that it uses and the philosophy that it follows and the considerations that you need to have in place, and so on and so forth.
Nasser, I did have one question come in, and that was from Kevin. He was wondering if there are known methods that can help teams, organizations change from the traditional waterfall methodology to the new Agile DevOps methodology.
So if the question is about a method of change, there is John Kotter's approach that talks about your organization transformation, and there are basically 8 steps. And actually, this is also a discussion as part of the certification program, right? So basically 8 steps to organization transformation, right? That will certainly set the stage in terms of how or what to consider and how to do it, what are the steps, and so on. Because now more and more you notice, I mean, there is also a certain philosophy. What I have to caution everybody is that we're not saying that your waterfall approach is no good anymore. This is not the message. The message is that the waterfall approach is not good for everything, and the agile approach is also not good for everything. So depending on what is the consideration, what is the business outcome that you're trying to introduce, or what is the product that you're trying to establish, in some cases, the waterfall approach is better. In other cases, the agile approach is better. So I don't want people to think, and that seems to be, unfortunately, the common understanding in the industry, that everything is agile. No, not everything is agile, right? So there are certainly certain points as to when you use agile and when you use the waterfall approach. But in terms of organizational transformation or organizational change, right? The 8th step of John Carter will help you through that venture.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much, Nasser. Kevin, I hope that answered your question. If not, you can always pop another comment in the QA box. We appreciate that. So again, have a couple minutes left, so if anybody does have some questions, we feel please forward that along. In the interim, I'll just let you know a couple of things that we have up and coming. We did hear the word Agile being mentioned a lot throughout the discussion, and we have a webinar coming up on February 9th on Agile Business Analysis. And I just put the title and the URL in the chat box, 10 reasons to develop a mature Agile Business Analysis competency. So if you're interested, you can go to our website. You can see that on the homepage and sign up for that webinar. Nasser also mentioned about the DevOps certification training. We do have an upcoming date for that, March 2nd and 3rd. As well, I put the URL for that course there too. So if you are interested in pursuing this, obtaining that certification, the course is there, and that does include the exam as well. So I guess no further questions that I have here. Nasser, did you have any other concluding comments?
No. Again, this is more and more a topic that is being discussed in the industry. Although it's very exciting, but I do want to caution people, especially in terms of how to introduce it, and also in terms of what certifications eventually you want to go after, especially that now you're going to have 3 or 4 different institutes that are introducing different certifications. These different certifications, on one hand, gives you the different choices, but on the other hand, they may be overlapping and or confusing. So please give it some proper thinking before you decide. If you need any assistance, to make the decision, drop us a line, and we'll certainly help you figure it out. And best of luck in your adventure. If we can be of any help, please let us know. We'll be more than happy to respond back to you.
Great. And just one other question that we can sneak one more in, Nasser. Again, if we could look down the road into the future, even 10, 15 years down the road, do you foresee organizations using both Waterfall and Agile on certain projects, or will it shift towards the majority of companies only using Agile?
Actually, very, very, very good question. That question needs a session on its own. But at a high level, as a matter of fact, as we're speaking, I'm running an enterprise architecture course. And within enterprise architecture, the traditional approach is Waterfall. Because at the end of the day, we know what we want, and we know, specifically how we're going to get there. And it calls for Waterfall approach. However, there are certain portions, right, of the architectural work that we are engaged in that may trigger Agile / Scrum, right, methodology. So you could actually blend the two within, a specific project, or within a specific, let me be more accurate, phases of the project. So a phase could be based on Waterfall, while another phase could be based on Agile Scrum, as an example, right? 10, 15 years down the road, it's really kind of hard to say, but I think 10, 15 years down the road, technology is going to be at a different stratosphere where potentially we might not even worry about all of this, and it will do it by itself. But honestly, I think we'll still see maybe a minimal kind of scope of Waterfall, and maybe more DevOps / Agile Scrum type of approach, right? Similar to what we used to do 20, 30 years ago, and we used to be heavy on things like COBOL and Pascal and all of this good stuff. And today, you know, what we used to take us forever to code, now it takes like seconds, right? So the same kind of approach.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Nasser. And I know you've graciously given up your noon hour. You're teaching a TOGAF course today, this week, so thank you for contributing your time. We thank everybody for joining us for this webinar, and we look forward to seeing you perhaps on a future webinar or one of our upcoming courses. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, guys. Take care.